Welcome to DORA Talks, the limited podcast series from Thomas Murray, in which experts from the worlds of banking, funds, risk management and cybersecurity explore the EU's Digital Operational Resilience Act. I'm Claire, and in this episode, Shreeji Doshi is talking all things risk with Phoebe Jordan and Nita Sinha. Shreeji is currently working with our cyber advisory team as its Director of Governance, Risk and Compliance. Phoebe Jordan is the Managing Director of Third-Party Risk Management here at Thomas Murray, and Nita manages our Technology Operations or TechOps team, and she's also been leading on TPRM product development. Unsurprisingly, Phoebe and Nita had some pretty tough questions for Shreeji. Let's see how he did.
So I suppose kicking off then, Shreeji, can you just give us a little bit of background as to why DORA is focusing on IT third-party risk and what the main interesting points are?
It's a great place to start off from because all the regulators are intending with DORA is they want to achieve stability and resilience in the financial service industry. That's their primary goal from the various types of attacks which are linked to cyber. And we've seen a huge proliferation of attacks into the financial service industries. Now, the reason why third parties become a critical part of this equation is because there are so many attacks that have been originating due to or from a third party.
And are there any that come to mind particularly?
Yeah, there are plenty of them. Couple of them that strikes my mind is one on LastPass, just like a password manager tool, and they had a huge breach. The other one, which I think very significant, was Okta, because they provide identity and access management solution. Though in the disclosure, they kind of indicated not many organizations were impacted, but an ICT third-party provider like Okta, which provides identity and access management solution, if they have a breach, it has significant ramifications on all of its clients, because in that breach, what had happened was the attacker was able to access session tokens to various customer environment. And with this, they were able to get access into organizations that were customers of Okta. Now, if, for example, there are plenty of financial organizations within EU, dependent on such a solution like Okta, which kind of provides identity and access management solution, the ramifications are significant. So these kind of critical ICT third parties, present significant risk if they have a breach to the entire financial service industry as a whole.
Okay, so that makes an awful lot of sense. Obviously, no one wants a breach from a third party. And what is DORA saying about managing the third parties? How are organizations supposed to go about it?
So there is a small nuance from DORA requirements in the context of third-party risk management. The scope is limited to ICT third parties. And it kind of, makes sense because DORA is digital operational resilience, so it is looking at digital disruption caused by ICT third parties. So that's a small nuance from a requirement point of view. What DORA is requesting at a very high level from financial entities in managing the risk from ICT third parties is that organizations need to have at a foundation level an inventory of all ICT third parties and third parties that support critical functions. So that's the cornerstone or the foundation that the regulation is bringing in. Now, most organizations would have some sort of inventory management process for this, but in my experience, this is something that they would need to formalize. In addition to that, there has to be a third-party risk management framework that assesses all types of risks from ICT third parties, so not just IT and cyber, legal, financial, etc. One very interesting requirement that is included in the DORA regulation is around concentration risk from these ICT third parties. Now, this is highly relevant from financial entities that have multiple operating companies across the member states, because there is a significant impact of the concentration of these ICT third parties, and they would have to assess this concentration risk. One of the very interesting requirements that have been prescribed in the regulation, and I use the word prescribed because it is quite prescriptive, as they are now laying out what clauses should be included in the contracts with this ICT third parties, and also clauses that are required for critical ICT third parties. Now, this is a significant move where the regulation is this prescriptive, which I think is great because it will bring consistency for the financial entities on how they manage ICT third party risks with clauses, with contractual terms. And that should benefit overall third party risk management across these financial entities.
Sure. And I think that's really logical just at the start there, as you were saying, that not all third parties in scope, but just the ICT ones and just those that are deemed critical. How can an organisation kind of determine which third parties are critical? And are there any organisations where you're thinking, does this count as an ICT organisation? Is there some cases where, you know, there are potentially third parties on the periphery of what you would consider in scope?
I think there is a clear definition within the regulation of what constitutes of ICT third parties, and what the ESAS has done so far is they've, given it an analysis by themselves in identifying what kind of third parties are ICT third parties. They, at a very high level, have published a report on the ICT landscape, and this was published, if I'm not mistaken, last September. If we go on to the details of that, what it had identified is they have around 15,000 ICT third parties serving around 1,600 EU financial entities. And out of these, around 9,000 were identified to be supporting critical and important functions. So in a way, the regulator has already kind of done, analysis for the organizations to kind of, provide a view. And this report is available for anyone to look at it. In addition to that, in determining criticality, there are already indicators that have been provided as to what kind of drives the criticality of ICT third parties, and how the regulator has already gone to identifying that, because there are specific requirements on assessments of these critical ICT third parties by the regulator itself. So they have already gone on to kind of provide that view of doing this. And at a high level, it basically says that, how many financial entities does a third party provide services to, how many assets or functions it's managing. Then is there alternatives available to ICT party, or they are very niche in what they are providing? Is it highly complex or very differentiating to migrate or change to someone? So they've kind of considered multiple parameters in defining this criticality.
And in terms of how an organisation categorizes its third parties, do you see it as important for the organisation to go any levels further than what's already out there, or they just need to take into account those that are quite clearly detailed as you just set out?
At an organization level, what they would need to assess is whether the third parties support business critical functions or not. And if we go back at a DORA regulation level, that's one of the requirements that forms part of the risk management framework, where organization needs to create like a repository of all business critical functions, what kind of assets, what kind of third parties are supporting it. So that's already been done outside of the chapter of third-party risk, ICT third-party risk management of DORA. It's already done at a risk management level. But once you have it, what the specific requirements that are there in the regulations are, what do you need to do about it? It's giving details around that.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. And so what kind of challenges, or rather, whose responsibility is it in an organization to pull this?
I think I'll have a very consulting answer. It depends. And this is primarily based on experience, having seen where the responsibility has sat in various organizations. Sometimes I've seen at a procurement level, sometimes I've seen at a risk management level, sometimes I've seen this responsibility sit in security. There is also legal where I've seen, this responsibility sit. Now, I think more importantly, the regulation is driving that there has to be some function and someone responsible to oversee this. It wouldn't matter where it sits. It's required is that there's someone delegated to oversee this and manage this in a structured way. In my experience, I think it's a lot easier to put it either in a risk organization or a procurement organization, as they would be coordinating most functions. So it does make sense. But again, it depends on how the organization is structured.
Is there any responsibility to report back to the regulator?
For ICT third parties, there is now with DORA mandatory reporting back to the regulator or competent authority. One is that at least once a year, organizations have to report any new arrangements for the use of ICT services. And we also already have a reporting template that has been provided by the regulator. So there is a reporting template already available in the regulatory text. Apart from that, there is also a mandatory requirement that in case if there is any changes to your ICT third-party providers providing to a critical function or an important function, that also needs to be reported. So for example, if there is a new critical function that you've identified and you have a third party that was not already in the list, that also needs to be notified back to the competent authority. Additionally, the competent authority would kind of request you to provide a full information register on an ad hoc basis. So there are some mandatory reporting requirements back to the regulator from an ICT third party, which will push organizations to ensure that they have a good inventory management process for ICT third parties.
Yes, certainly essential that you've got everything, all your ducks in a row so that you're able to respond and notify in the right way. So we mentioned earlier about concentration risk and exit strategies. Where should an organization start when it comes to trying to manage their third parties from a DORA perspective?
Well, I think fundamental to any TPRM program is a framework. So if at an organization level, there has to be like a third-party risk management framework. Now, this framework has various components to it. First is strategy. At a strategy level, what's their vendor strategy? What's their model like? What are the policies? What are the various governance mechanisms? So this would be one of the components or the pillars within that framework. Then we spoke, inventory being a cornerstone, which also is part of the framework. And it's at the heart of that framework because everything would kind of center around that inventory and categorization. So currently the regulators are saying either critical or non-critical. You can further also categorize non-critical into various segments depending on the type of data they have access to, how they have access to, which kind of, you could then, based on that inherent risk, you could reduce the governance that you put on managing the risk around those. So there are various elements to that. Then what kind of risk are you going to assess out of these third parties? What are the risk models? How are you going to look at it at an aggregate level? That kind of risk domain, risk modeling questionnaires that are going to come to. And there is the full life cycle management process around all the third parties in that inventory that you would need to have. So doing an initial assessment, due diligence, contracting, taking in input, of that initial assessment, what were the risks identified, how are you managing that risk if you're not managing this risk, what is the governance around it, ongoing monitoring and assessments, which is also an integral part of that process. How frequently do you assess ICT third parties? Do you do on-site visit? Do you visit, or do you do a remote assessment or a self-assessment? What kind of risk domains are you going to assess during this?
Lots to think about.
There are lots to think about. There's like issue and risk management. So once you do that assessment, if you found out some issues, how are you going to deal with it? Termination, the entire contracting piece. And then on top of this, you need to report it on a regular basis so that your governance bodies that are being set up has adequate information to take action on. So in my opinion, an organization who's looking to do a DORA compliance should look at it more holistically to see, what framework they have already in place from a third-party risk management, what refinements they would need to do on that. And once they kind of put those refinements in place, they consider the DORA requirements so that they are compliant to it.
Sure. So this really goes beyond DORA, doesn't it? I mean, it's a global requirement really to ensure that you're not exposed to the third parties that you're working with. And you mentioned at the start there just the inventory, and it's interesting. We've been on quite a few meetings or calls with organizations, and actually just understanding who your third parties are in the very first instance can be a challenge in itself, especially when you've got lots of different departments or kind of areas of the organization acting, in silos in some cases. So actually centralizing that information is really valuable.
And challenging, to be honest, because, like you mentioned, there are business units that have been provided with budgets to go procure themselves. And with the SaaS applications, there are so many ICT providers that a business can just and buy because they have been allocated or delegated that authority to procure. So it's very important to look at, that kind of process when you're setting up governance to see what is, delegated to business from a procurement point of view. How is it that you can identify on a regular basis that a business has procured some sort of ICT third party that a central team may not be aware of, and that I think is very critical.
So that's definitely a challenge. Are there any other challenges that you think organizations face when managing third parties?
In general, in management of third parties, I think in my experience, how much influence you have with third parties kind of drive on how you manage the issues and risk that stems from them. And that's always been a challenge. But now with the regulatory push, it should become less challenging. That's my hypothesis to be seen. The other thing that I typically see organization, struggle with is assessing various types of risk of third parties. There is a whole universe of risk that one needs to assess. It goes beyond security, it's financial risk, it's regulatory compliance risk, operational risk, the multiple risk areas that one needs to kind of assess. How do you factor that in the decision-making process? Now, that's always a challenge because there is no one-size-fits-all way of translating those risk assessments, those risk models into decision-making process. There is a huge element of integrating it within the existing risk management process because that will kind of guide, anyone who's kind of designing or refining that to kind of take that in. So these are the couple of, and reporting on a regular basis. We go back to the earlier challenge of centralization. I think if there is like a centralized function to manage this, I think then some of these challenges can be tackled in a meaningful way.
How can organizations tackle these centralization and kind of administrative burden challenges that they have?
Technology is the answer.
Technology, I think, absolutely is the answer. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Because, there is an entire process. So I spoke about the life cycle process, right? And risk models. In order for these to kind of work in a harmonized way, doing it on an Excel sheet becomes very, very challenging. So it can be challenging when the volume is huge. It can be challenging when the resourcing is short. To ensure that the information is consistent and updated at all the times. Now, one way of mitigating that is having a tool that kind of holds most of these requirements that you need from a third-party risk management point of view. So obviously, the policies, they still need to be documented outside the tool. They need to be promoted outside of the tool. But those policies will drive governance process. Those governance process can be implemented on the technology. The inventory can be stored on technology platform. The risk modules can be configured on the technology. The questionnaire can be configured on the technology. Running the entire lifecycle management process can be done through technology platforms, and there are technology platforms available. So
a
it
technology
does.
solution on its own won't solve all your problems necessarily, but as part of a kind of comprehensive framework and strategy, it can definitely go a long way. I guess now would be a great opportunity to bring in Nita, Sinha, who works in our technology operations team at Thomas Murray. So Thomas Murray has supported hundreds of organizations with managing due diligence process, so issuing questionnaires, receiving responses, so that element of third-party risk management. Nita, if I was an organization that was looking to leverage managing third parties, what could I get from the technology? What would kind of be the benefits of using technology?
Thank you. So first of all, thank you for having me part of this conversation. I've been involved in the TPRM landscape for the last several years and seen it evolve over the last few years. So it's been great to be on this journey and share some of that experience with you today. At Thomas Murray, and in terms of the technology, I would say, first of all, when you're looking at a technology solution, it should aim to eliminate manual processes as much as possible. So we have clients of all sizes, small and large, and depending on your size of organization, you'll have different challenges, but you can have tools supporting your use case. And that is what you want out of the tool. So you should be looking to reduce your administrative burden rather than increasing it and having long processes and training of adopting a new solution like this. Other key points which clients value, and of course you would want out of a tool, is the flexibility of the tool, I would say, because I think a standardized risk framework is very important. All companies are striving towards that with standardized questionnaires and stuff, but not necessarily the framework that the tool is offering is right for your company. So when you are making a decision, when you're evaluating, the flexibility is quite important. It should adapt to your framework so that you can solve your challenges and problems with this. And
If I may, sorry,
sure.
on this, I think you raise a very important point. I think there's one way to look at it. These technology platforms, they bring in what good looks like from a process point of view, right? So because there is so much experience of these technology platforms of running this over multiple clients, there is an element of best practices that these technology platform brings, and it should drive the refinement of the framework. So there has to be like a balance between customizing the technology platform and against the requirements, maybe adopting some elements of the best practices that the platform brings in the framework. How do you see that?
Absolutely, yes. And we do see that journey with clients because once you are using a platform, then you are centralizing your information and you're centralizing your reporting and analysis of it. And once you have the single source of truth, then you can actually see where the problems are, what you want to improve, what you want to standardize, and it helps both ways. Exactly, truly with that. Right. So, and maybe just the final point to add in terms of technology choices, then reporting is also a key aspect of it because you are taking in a lot of data through questionnaires, through other data feeds. A lot of information is being presented to you. So how do you extract the key information which matters and bring it to the forefront? And again, the key information for different organizations might be different. So you want a tool that will be able to leverage and present those facts to you in a very easy to use manner. Yeah, so there are some points.
When thinking about the number of third parties that you're working with, is there a critical mass at which point you think, yes, now's the time to kind of use a technology platform? Is there a critical mass?
I would say in our experience, we have helped clients with very small number of third parties, as well as clients who might have a very large number of third parties. And And it's interesting in both landscapes because when the volume is high, so we are talking thousands of entities over here, then of course the volumes are very, very large and it's impossible to deal that manually. So you definitely need a tool to help automate your processes and help you with it. But when we're talking about our smaller clients, what we normally find is generally they're a smaller team that have a small number of providers. And in their case, their resources, their analysts, they are best utilized bringing in the value add stuff rather than doing these administrative processes. So these type of clients do really appreciate using the tool and it helps them throughout. And as we've been talking over the last few years, the regulatory landscape has increased. The requirement to monitor third parties has increased. So every company, big or small, you have a requirement, to monitor these third parties. So I would say it applies in all cases.
Yeah, sure. And it kind of acts as an extension of your team. So if that's a small team, it can add a considerable kind of effort or support resource. And you mentioned in terms of feedback from existing clients, what kind of reaction have you had? Sometimes we hear about clients or potential organizations being concerned around the kind of, I think you mentioned earlier, the initial resource required to set up and manage the technology. What kind of feedback do you hear from clients that have adopted the platform?
Again, it varies depending on the volume and the size, but I would say there are overarching common themes for the different types of clients, and standardizing their processes, doing the value add stuff, and being able to very easily identify the risk and just feeling you are in control, because that comes from transparency of information that you're getting from these tools. So it does help clients in these areas, and this is sort of the main benefits and the feedback we've had from these clients. In terms of adoption of the tool, sometimes it might not be just one tool and you would need to bring in other data sources, have integrations, depending on the requirements. And then you would combine and bring that overall picture, which depends on the client needs. But yeah, that is where the value comes to the client, and just, being totally in control of your third-party risks.
Being in control, being able to focus on the value add, that makes a lot of sense. And I think we're seeing a rise in the number of organizations interested in managed services as well, where they can turn to an outsourced provider to actually carry out the administrative element and take away that burden.
Absolutely. And yes, we see in our world, we have seen that, especially where there is a large number of third parties that they are monitoring. So even with the automated part of the tool, there is still requirements to sort of either make sure the answers are validated, sort of follow through some of the processes. So there's still a number of things that to date require some sort of human input. And when you're going for a managed services, all of these are standardized and they're done in a very process-driven manner. So again, it helps the client focus on the value-add stuff and their input and analysis. And that's where the managed service comes into play.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed those insights and the discussion of some of the practical ways of achieving DORA compliance. If you have any comments, feedback, or questions for Shreeji, Phoebe, or Nita, please do get in touch. Just visit thomasmurray.com or email us dora@thomasmurray.com. Those details are in the show notes, along with how to access all of our other DORA-related content, including our free DORA Readiness Toolkit. In our next episode, Shreeji talks to Steve Merry and Andy Clark from the Funds Advisory team. Steve and Andy ask about what DORA might mean for pension funds and whether DORA has any allowance for proportionality when it comes to implementation. See you then.